Let the people read and make Kaiser bleed. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is February 9th, 2021. And on this date in history in 1953, Senator Joseph McCarthy came forward with a list of 205 members of the State Department that were suspected communist. He would do this to get attention and hopefully get into the presidency. It turns out the list was made up. Sorry, I've got a hiccup. And if it were true, then that meant that we had communists working for our government. So everyone, I will talk to you later. Hugs and love. Okay, so we begin talking about Great Britain and the makeup of their society. Okay, we're going to start with the upper class. This is the top 5%, and in very similar fashion to the United States, they controlled 40% of the wealth. Okay, so a lot of them were plutocrats who were aristocrats whose wealth came from renting land. And this is something where generational wealth came into play, and you might be renting out land over several different generations to the same people, charging the same amounts, and that's how you're able to do everything. The number of people that are plutocrats, though, is going to decrease by about 65% because there's a lot of people from the wealthy middle class. These are people that might own factories or industries or some type of company that have become very wealthy, and they marry in to bring more money into the upper class. A lot of middle classers also went to prestigious schools like Oxford and married into these families to get this kind of royal treatment. Now, this is going to sound like an oxymoron, but you have the middle class. And so, in this case, it's not like a certain percentage of Americans like in the middle, but the next 15%. So, still in some ways the upper class. You had a combination of lawyers, doctors, civil service agents. Civil service were people that worked for the government. Small businessmen. Now, middle class women, they were shut out of a lot of these areas, and they were expected to be in the home, cleaning the home, managing the home, taking care of the children's education, cooking, all of the domestic sphere. Okay, so this type of stereotype doesn't just start in the United States, it's also in Great Britain. Now, the lower class, this is 80%. Now, not everyone here is in poverty, but it just depends. You've got about 80% of the population. They forced the peasant children, really all children, to go to school. They had compulsory education. And not only that, but they were also pushing a certain type of dialect of the upper class, and also pushed national loyalties. So things like history were a very important class for them to take to help create a certain level of patriotism for the people there. Many members of the lower class were skilled laborers. So these skilled laborers could make as much money as many people in the middle class and be extremely wealthy, but their positions were looked down on, mainly because they did a lot of manual labor. This could be someone like a plumber, an electrician, a carpenter, a welder. There were a large number of jobs that were held by these groups that paid really well, but anyway, they were still looked down on by the rest of society. 1 out of 7 people in the lower class actually worked as domestic servants. Many of these were women, and you went through and you made sure that you might be working the kitchen. You might be the valet, which means that you would dress the lord of the manor, or the lord in waiting. Women would have ladies in waiting who would help them get ready, help them get dressed each day. Victorian England, which is this time period, it's called the Victorian Age because of Queen Victoria. the longest reigning monarch in English history until the early 2010s. They supported males' roles in business, in politics, and war, but wanted women to stay in these domestic roles. This cult of domesticity, which is really embraced in the United States, also spills over into England. And Isabella Beaton writes a book called The Book of Household Management to support this cult of domesticity. Now, education and literacy. Okay, most of the countries in Western Europe and a few in Eastern Europe are really starting to push for compulsory education, and this is leading to universal literacy throughout most of Europe, at least in the West. And this will kind of influence a lot of the other things we're talking about today. Female teachers. 2/3 of all the teachers in the U.S. were women by 1880. And this also starts to go into Great Britain as well. Barbara Bodichin, she trained girls for economic independence and domesticity to try and perpetuate this whole concept of the cult of domesticity, women's places in the home, and she's a moral and religious center of the home, and while she doesn't vote or have a voice in government, the way that she brings up the next generation will truly show her voice. That was the belief. I'm not trying to say that's fact. The Education Act of 1870. This is the foundation of elementary education in Great Britain. Again, this is for compulsory education of all children. Now, Germany at the same time is extending gymnasia and Realschule to all the classes. And this is a much more specialized education based on the skills of the students in question. So, once you're in about the 5th or 6th grade, you take an exam, and it kind of depends on how you do on this, on what you do with the rest of your life. They have an art school, but then they also have a school for people that want to work for the government or work as an attorney. So you would go to a special school for that. You'd have a special school for the sciences. You'd have then you'd also have like a trade school. And the trade school, you might learn how to be a plumber, an electrician, a carpenter. There were a great many number of things that you might learn to do, depending on which educational path you went into. So adult illiteracy was virtually gone in Western Europe. Okay, Eastern Europe still had really high illiteracy rates, but not really in the West. So most of the areas where Americans were okay with immigrants coming from, they had very high literacy rates. Also at this time, you have the creation of the Evening News and the Daily News, and these were both major newspapers that sold in Great Britain, but they were all focused on yellow journalism, and so they sold exaggerated stories or made-up stories in order to sell newspapers, and they wrote in a very easy-to-understand style. They found that most people were reading on about a 4th or 5th grade level. Now, the Scouts were also created during this time period, and again, there's a big concern with leisure time that if people have too much time on their hands, they'll foment rebellion and try and overthrow the government. So to prevent this from happening, they would organize several different levels of groups and in society. So the Boy Scouts were actually founded by Robert Baden-Powell in 1908 in Britain. This included boys 12 to 18. This will teach them patriotism, self-sacrifice, masculinity. These are all Victorian values, how to survive in the wild, all types of survival skills, and teamwork as well. A lot of these traits, much like athletics, it would make them easier to groom for military service. Now, the Girl Scouts were actually founded by Robert Baden-Powell's sister, Agnes, and it was to try and organize women in the same Victorian values, the cult of domesticity, but also one of the slogans was to raise the slum girl from the gutter. So basically, get the girl who is one of the dregs of society and help build her up to a point where she can be a participating or contributory person to society. That she could marry someone, have children, and build on the wealth and the breadth of the British Empire. So mass politics. Okay, you have several liberal movements that create constitutional governments throughout Europe, representative assemblies. You saw the change that happened in France, and it's happening in Great Britain, but kind of at a slower scale, but nonetheless. You have free trade, you have male suffrage, so most of the men could vote, and the middle class gets very involved. Part of that is they had the wealth, and so they kind of move themselves up to a level of importance like the upper class. Okay? Mass communication and telegraphs made it possible to send messages almost instantly. The telephone in 1876, created by Alexander Graham Bell, makes it possible to communicate more easily over distance. Radios by Marconi made it possible to send out waves and signals and messages over much larger distances. You also have newspapers and magazines for communicating ideas to the general population. Democracy and authoritarianism, there was representation in constitutions, but they still had dynasties that were very involved in policy making. In fact, during this time period, most of the royal families will get married into the British royal family in one level or another. So by the time World War I happens, every household of the royal families in Europe and even Eastern Europe and Turkey have a member of the British royal family and are separated by cousins, and I don't think anyone's separated by more than a second cousin. Okay, so in British Parliament, Prime Minister William Gladstone really changed a lot of things done in British society. He really pushed for a mandate from Parliament that required universal schooling for all children. They pushed in the secret ballot. For those of you who took U.S. history, you'd be familiar with patronage or the spoil system, where they give government jobs to supporters of the winning party. But in addition to that, they also used intimidation, threatening people's lives or children, or whether or not they could ever get a job based on who they voted for. You had to go in, say your name, and declare who you were voting for on every ballot. So if you didn't vote for they wanted to, they might kill you, might stab you, or hurt your children. And it was something that was prevented by the secret ballot, so no one knew who you were voting for. They legalized unions to try and take care of the working class. They created civil service exams to also cut out the spoil system and patronage. So then instead of getting a job just because of who you supported when you voted, civil service jobs were given out based on scores on exams to try and give the most qualified people those jobs. They got rid of religious requirements for universities. Up until about the beginning of the 20th century, most universities were mainly for studying to become a minister of some sort or to become a lawyer. They also de-established the Anglican Church in Ireland and allowed the Irish to continue to practice Catholicism, which is what they'd wanted, throughout most of history. Now, due to the creation of Austria-Hungary and their dual parliamentary system, where they had a parliament set up for both the Austrians and Hungarians, the Irish wanted to have the same opportunity. So Charles Parnell, who's in charge of the Irish representatives, called for home rule in Ireland, and he wanted to have a separate parliament, just like in Austria-Hungary. Now, Benjamin Disraeli, this is another person working to try and protect the common man. He tried to protect workers from industrialization. in some of the industries, you might have as many as 500,000 injuries a year working in factories. And we're talking severe injuries where someone might die, someone might lose a limb, or be permanently disabled because of an accident that happened at work. And there's absolutely no protection to any of the workers. There was poor sanitation in most places. They didn't have a place to go to the bathroom, just a bucket, and no place to wash your hands. And really, it's not until the 1920s that you have toilet paper that's used, and most people were using their left hand and working in the food industry or in other industries that could spread bacteria and disease to other people. The real miracle through most of the time period before the 20th century is that anyone survived, with massive problems with dysentery, because once you have so many people living in a single area, their fecal matter and urine ends up in the drinking water supply if it's not filtered, and they really didn't have good filtering systems at that time. So you might have, well, even today, there's 5,000 people a day that will die of diarrhea from the drinking water that they drink, and they'll become so dehydrated that they die. And so that's 5,000 people in 2021. And you look at that time period back then, you probably had closer to 7,000 to 10,000 people a day in major metropolitan areas dying from the same thing. Also, public housing was in such poor conditions that many people would die because of bacteria and molds growing in their homes. So anyone planning on time travel, good luck going back to this time period and working as a common worker. Okay, France and the Third Republic. So France changed governments like a girl changes clothes. Okay? You have the French Revolution and the number of changes in government from that. You have the turnover right afterwards when you brought Napoleon back in, the establishment of the monarchy, then the creation of the republic, followed by the empire, and now you have a third republic. This one's actually going to last for about 65 years. Okay, a lot of moderate Republicans actually shot revolutionaries. Okay, Louise Michel, a school teacher, actually helped lead the Paris Commune, and she is exiled with 10,000 other French people on the penal colony in New Caledonia. That's actually off the coast of Australia, or in French Polynesia, so kind of in the middle of the Pacific, and there you would do hard labor. This treatment of women in the revolution was done to discourage women to rebel in the future. So the thought was, if they're harsh enough with people, that won't happen. And normally, well, up until about 100 years before, women were never really a concern during revolutions because they'd never really been a concern before. And whenever they overthrow and they eventually arrest Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, which leads to their beheadings, then women are taken a lot more seriously. In fact, it's women during the Russian Revolution that really take down the royal family again. Emile Zola condemns the authoritarian institutions that had been doing things like this in her book J'accuse. Okay. By the way, that was also a good way to get sent over to penal colonies. The Constitution of 1875 establishes the Third Republic, and this will last until Hitler destroys it in 1940. General Georges Boulanger, he led a group of monarchists and Bonapartists and aristocrats and nationalists. So he got several groups and got them together. And all these people wanted revenge on Germany for destroying the French Empire. He had full power. He could have taken over the government, but whenever he was about to lead a coup d'etat, he instead fled the country. He decided he didn't want the responsibility. And when this falls apart, it helps really create the republic that we were just speaking about. Spain. Spain, if you notice, kind of really falls off the map, really towards the beginning of this course, After about 1650, they really are just kind of in the background. The Catholic Church is still in charge of the country. Okay, there were two political parties, but they were almost the same thing. You had the liberals and the conservatives, but not a major difference. Spain will get involved in a war with the United States, and when they are just stomped by the American forces, they lose 60,000 people, and the Americans lose 400 people to voting and another 5,500 to dysentery. Okay, again, dysentery was a horrible thing that happened during warfare, where people would die of diarrhea, and you serve to go and fight and give your life to your country, and you die on a toilet because when they bring everyone together and don't filter the water well, you end up drinking water with poo in it and then dying. This leads to the generation of 1898 following the 4-month war, and they call for social reform, and there's a major armed clash in Barcelona, and it's caused by people that have major problems with the way they're running the government. And there's a bunch of anarchists that will actually keep Spain out of world wars. So basically Spain, nothing of any type of significance happens at this point. They tried to change things, but really they want to stay out of most things. Now, Germany. If you remember, the army was as big of a part of the Prussian state as the people in charge and the people that lived there. So they really saw themselves as a defender of monarchy and aristocracy, the wealthy people of the country. Most of the military leaders were from the aristocracy and some of the more important middle-class families. So the army was basically there to protect them and not necessarily the common man. Common man was often called up to be in the Prussian military, which was very aggressive, very successful, but also punished quite harshly. Now, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the architect of Germany, the man who brought all the smaller kingdoms together and formed the country of Germany, he really works to try and restrict the power of the church and the Kulturkampf. Okay, he kicks out all the Jesuits. Now, if you remember, the Jesuits were originally kicked out of France, but then they were allowed to move into Germany to take advantage of some of their talents. He also is going to jail all of the bishops, so everyone that works for the Catholic Church. Pope Pius IX is going to condemn this religious toleration that they have that allowed people to join the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church or whatever religion that they wanted to join. But that didn't stop Otto von Bismarck, who's also pushing for nationalism and this belief and in the greatness of the German people. Okay, Pope Pius IX is going to call for papal infallibility in what's called the syllabus of errors, which means that it's impossible for the Pope to make a mistake. Okay, so all these things that Otto von Bismarck was doing, the Pope was standing in direct opposition to. Now, after Pius IX dies, Bismarck will go in and form an alliance with the Catholic Church, that still doesn't put the Catholic religion over the other religions. And most of the other things he was doing, he would continue to do despite what the Pope was saying that he couldn't do. So there's an assassination attempt on Kaiser Wilhelm I. And I don't know if Bismarck knew about it or just used it, but he did this to, he used the attempt to pass anti-socialist laws to keep socialists from publishing their own newspaper. But despite the fact he was against socialism, he also initiated the first welfare program in Europe that would provide help for people with, the elderly, people that have been involved in accidents, the unemployed, and health benefits. Okay, so basically, Bismarck created the same thing that was done in the United States with Social Security in the 1930s, and they were about 30 years before that. Bismarck also worked with a group, the Pan-German League, and passed protective tariffs to try and grow German business. And German industries explode in their creation during this time period. When William I dies, Wilhelm II will take over, and the first thing he does is lets Bismarck go and works with the SPD and expanding the German Empire. So, despite everything that Otto von Bismarck does for Germany, he's kind of pushed out the door by the new Kaiser. So Austria-Hungary, 1/3 of the population were actually German. Okay, now they saw themselves as Austrians, but the truth is there's not much difference between Austrian and German. Almost all their culture and traditions are the same, as well as their language. This 1/3 of the population, though, ruled the country, and you had several other minority groups that wanted to get in on the ruling of the country. Okay, so Prime Minister Edward von Taft allowed Slavic languages to be used in education as well as German. Okay, so the German side was a lot more tolerant than the Magyars. Okay, the Magyars or the Hungarians. The Magyars imposed their culture on Slavic minorities. They were forced to, use the language, learn the traditions, and kind of ignore everything that they were before. The government does expand voting rights, and anti-Semitism is going to explode throughout Austria with the Christian Social Party. And one of the big leaders of this anti-Semitic group, and anti-Semitism is basically the mistreatment and hatred of Jews. And that's the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger. And he tried to pursue policies of restriction and exclusion against the Jews. And a lot of this is pretty pervasive in Hitler's youth. So Hitler, again, was born during this time and sees a lot of this as he's growing up. This brings us to the end of yet another day. The same advice I always have for you: please don't cocaine, please don't AIDS, and don't COVID. Okay? If you see people doing that, wash your hands and go away. It's okay. You're not a coward. You're just trying to ensure your safety. Everyone be safe, but don't be safe, and I will see you in just a few days. Study for your test.